The smell of barbicide and pomade, the hum of clippers against skin, morning light filtering through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across black and white checkered floors. This was Eddie Wilson's kingdom, a 12 by 15-foot barbershop in Harlem where legends came to look human again. But Tuesday mornings belonged to only one man. James Brown would arrive before the open sign was flipped, lock the door behind him, pull the curtains, and for the next 47 minutes, his lips would move in a continuous whisper while Eddie's scissors danced. 3 people knew about this ritual. James knew, Eddie knew, and Bobby Bird knew. Because one Tuesday morning in 1971, Bobby showed up early and heard something through that door that made him press his forehead against the glass and close his eyes. Years later, when a documentary crew asked Bobby what made James different, he said something cryptic. James had a conversation with himself that the rest of us weren't invited to, but it kept him alive. The interviewer didn't understand. The footage was cut. But Eddie Wilson understood perfectly. Because he'd been hosting that conversation for 19 years, listening to words that would explain everything we never understood about the Godfather of Soul. Words he kept secret until his hands were too old to hold scissors anymore, and his conscience too heavy to stay silent. Before we continue this remarkable story, please subscribe to stay connected with more untold legends. Eddie Wilson had been cutting hair in Harlem since 1947. He'd seen everything. Musicians fresh off their first hit record, still smelling like the Greyhound bus that brought them north. Boxers before their title fights, wanting their hair just right for the press photos. Preachers, hustlers, poets, and dreamers. Each one brought their own energy into that small shop on 125th Street. But nothing prepared Eddie for the morning James Brown first walked through his door in 1962. It was late April, and the cherry blossoms were dropping their petals like pink snow across the sidewalks. Eddie was sweeping up from the previous day when he heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and rhythmic. He looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the dawn light, wearing a hat pulled low and a collar turned high despite the warming spring air. When Eddie unlocked the door, James Brown stepped inside without a word, removed his hat, and simply pointed to the chair. That first session, James didn't whisper. He sat rigid as a statue, his jaw clenched so tight Eddie could see the muscles working beneath the skin. The only sound was the scissors and the occasional rumble of the subway beneath their feet. When Eddie finished, James stood, placed a $50 bill on the counter, 5 times the normal rate, and spoke his first words. Same time next week. Door locked, curtains closed. Nobody else. Then he was gone, leaving Eddie standing there with questions stacking up in his mind, like unpaid bills. The following Tuesday, James arrived at the same time, performed the same ritual with the door and curtains, and settled into the chair. But this time, as Eddie began to work, James closed his eyes and started to whisper. The words were so soft at first that Eddie thought he might be imagining them, a trick of the morning quiet. He leaned closer, his scissors pausing mid-cut, and realized James was speaking in a continuous stream, like a man reciting something he'd memorized long ago but couldn't forget. Eddie caught fragments. Names he didn't recognize, places that sounded southern, rural, far from the bright lights of Harlem, and one phrase that repeated, over and over, woven through the other words, like a thread through fabric. Eddie's hands steadied as he continued cutting, but his mind was racing. He'd heard confessions before, heard men unburden themselves in the safety of the barber's chair. But this was different. This wasn't confession. This was something closer to incantation. Week after week, the ritual continued. James would arrive before dawn, transform Eddie's shop into a sealed chamber, and whisper his way through the haircut. Eddie began to recognize patterns in the words, could predict when certain phrases would emerge. He noticed that James's breathing would change during specific parts of the whisper, becoming shallow and quick, as if he were reliving something that required him to be very quiet, very still, very careful not to be discovered. It was Bobby Bird who first confirmed that Eddie wasn't imagining the strangeness of these sessions. Bobby had been James's closest friend and musical partner since their days together in Georgia, when they were both young men trying to claw their way out of poverty through music. Bobby knew James's moods, his habits, his superstitions. But he didn't know about the Tuesday mornings until he accidentally stumbled into them. That morning in 1971, Bobby had come to the shop looking for James. They had a recording session scheduled, and James hadn't shown up at the studio. Someone mentioned seeing him head toward Eddie's place, and Bobby walked over, assuming he'd find James getting a quick trim before work. What he found instead stopped him cold on the sidewalk outside. Through the window, past the gap in the curtains, Bobby could see James in the chair. His eyes were closed, his lips moving constantly, and his hands were gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Eddie stood behind him, scissors moving in slow, careful arcs, his face carrying an expression Bobby had never seen on the usually jovial Barber. It was a look of deep concentration, mixed with something else. Concern, maybe even fear. Bobby pressed closer to the glass, trying to hear what James was saying, but the words were too muffled. All he could make out was the rhythm of it, the relentless forward push of language, and underneath it, something that sounded almost like pain. Bobby stood there for several minutes, his forehead against the cool glass, listening to the muffled whisper of his best friend's voice, carrying secrets Bobby realized he might never fully understand. When he finally walked away, he never mentioned it to James. Some doors, once you realize they're closed, you don't try to open. As the years passed, Eddie began to understand the structure of James's whispered ritual. It wasn't random. It wasn't stream of consciousness. It was a carefully constructed sequence, always in the same order, always hitting the same emotional beats. The ritual began with names. First, his mother's name, spoken soft and careful, like he was afraid saying it too loud might summon her ghost. Then other names. Some Eddie recognized from newspapers and music magazines, others completely unknown. After the names came the places. Barnwell, South Carolina. The house with the red door, the pine trees that swayed in the summer heat. The road that led to Augusta. Each location was described in a whispered detail, as if James were walking through them in his mind, seeing things exactly as they'd been decades ago. Eddie noticed that James's breathing would slow during this part, becoming deep and measured, almost meditative. But then came the third part, and this was where Eddie's own heart would begin to race. This was the part that made Bobby Bird press his forehead against the glass. This was the section that contained whatever truth James Brown had been carrying since before fame found him, before the Apollo Theater knew his name, before the world called him the Godfather of Soul. And it was this part that Eddie Wilson kept locked in his memory for 38 years, because James had made him promise, and Eddie was a man who kept his promises. By 1965, James Brown was becoming a phenomenon. His performance at the Apollo Theater had been recorded and released as a live album, and it was climbing charts most people didn't think a live recording could even touch. The energy he brought to that stage was something new, something that made people forget they were just watching a man sing. He became the music, embodied it in a way that seemed almost supernatural. And every Tuesday morning, he would come to Eddie's shop and whisper his ritual. Eddie began to notice something during this period. The more successful James became, the longer the whispered ritual would take. What had started as a 10-minute murmur stretched to 20, then 30, then the full 47 minutes that became standard. It was as if success was adding weight to whatever burden James carried, making it harder to set down even temporarily. The words came faster, more urgent, and sometimes Eddie would see tears tracking down James's face while his lips continued their relentless movement. One morning, after a particularly intense session, James opened his eyes and looked at Eddie in the mirror. For the first time in 3 years of Tuesday mornings, he acknowledged what they both knew was happening. "You ever carry something so long you forget what it feels like to put it down?" James asked. Eddie nodded, because even though he didn't know the details, he understood the weight of secrets. James continued, "This thing I do here with you, it's the only time all week I get to say it out loud. Even if it's just whispers, even if nobody else hears, it keeps me from drowning in it." The ritual continued through James's peak years, through Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and the birth of funk, through Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and the Civil Rights Movement, through marriages and divorces, triumphs and scandals. Every Tuesday, without fail, James Brown would lock the door to Eddie Wilson's barbershop and whisper his way through 47 minutes of whatever truth he couldn't speak anywhere else in his life. But then came the morning that changed everything. was 1981, and James arrived at the shop looking different. Older somehow, though he was only 48. The energy that usually animated him, even in the quiet of the barbershop, seemed diminished. He settled into the chair, and Eddie began to work, waiting for the whisper to start. But this time, James spoke at normal volume, his voice rough and tired. "Eddie, I need to tell you what these words mean. Because if something happens to me, somebody needs to know. Not just the words, but why they matter. Why I can't stop saying them." Eddie's scissors paused. In 19 years, they had never discussed the content of the ritual directly. It was an unspoken agreement, a professional boundary that made the whole thing possible. But now James was offering to cross that line, and Eddie had to decide whether to follow. What James Brown revealed that morning would haunt Eddie Wilson for the rest of his life. The whispered words weren't a prayer or a poem or a song. They were a list, a catalog, a counting of every time James Brown, born James Joseph Brown on May 3rd, 1933 in Barnwell, South Carolina, had felt invisible. Every time he'd been looked through instead of looked at. Every moment of his childhood and adolescence, when poverty and race and circumstance had conspired to make him feel like he didn't exist, like he was just empty space in the shape of a boy. His mother leaving when he was 4 years old, the way she'd walked out the door without looking back, as if he wasn't even there to say goodbye to. The years living with his aunt in a house that serviced men, where young James would hide in closets and under beds, trying to make himself disappear while the adults pretended he already had. The times he'd gone to school hungry, his stomach so empty it hurt, and teachers would look right past him like he was a ghost. The day he'd been arrested as a teenager for stealing, and the judge had addressed the courtroom about him as if he wasn't standing right there, capable of hearing every word that would determine his future. But the list didn't end with childhood. James continued, his voice getting softer. And Eddie realized the ritual had evolved over the years to include new entries. The music executive who'd signed him to federal records but never actually looked at him during meetings, directing all comments to the white intermediaries. The venues that would book him but make him use the back entrance, the service doors, the spaces meant for people who weren't supposed to be seen. The reviewers who wrote about his music but described him in ways that erased his humanity, turned him into a force or a phenomenon or a curiosity, but never a man. Every Tuesday morning for 19 years, James Brown had been reciting this list, speaking into existence all the moments when the world had tried to erase him. And he'd kept doing it, even after fame made him one of the most recognized men in America, because fame hadn't erased the list. It had only added a new category. The times when people saw his fame, but not him. The fans who wanted James Brown the performer, but recoiled from James Brown the man. The journalists who wanted quotes and stories, but never asked how he was really doing. The industry that wanted his music, his energy, his innovation, but balked at giving him control or respect or basic human acknowledgement. "I say their names," James told Eddie, tears now flowing freely down his face while the barber's hands remained steady. "Every person who looked through me, every moment I was invisible. I say it all out loud, whisper it into existence, because if I don't, I start to believe it. I start to think maybe I really am invisible. Maybe I really am just what they want me to be, nothing more. This ritual, Eddie, it's how I remind myself I'm real. That I existed before fame, and I'll exist after it. That all those moments of invisibility happened to someone, a real person, not a ghost." Eddie understood then why James had chosen a barber for this ritual. Barbers occupy a unique space in their communities. They're trusted with vulnerability, with the delicate work of shaping how a person presents to the world. They're privy to conversations and confessions that happen nowhere else. And they're expected to keep those confidences, to be witnesses who don't judge and don't share. James had needed a witness for his invisible moments, someone who would hear the list and confirm, by hearing it, that those moments had been real. For the next several years, Eddie carried this knowledge alone. James continued the Tuesday ritual, though now sometimes they would talk after. Brief conversations where James might add context to a new entry, or explain why an old memory had resurfaced with particular intensity that week. Eddie watched as James's life became increasingly complicated, as legal troubles and personal struggles played out in public, while the man himself seemed to be disappearing behind the headlines, becoming invisible again, despite being constantly visible. The last time James came to the shop was in 2004. He was 71 years old, his hair more gray than black, his movements slower, but still carrying that essential James Brown energy. He'd been through so much by then. Legal battles and health problems, and the death of his third wife, Adrienne, under circumstances that still haunted him. He settled into the chair, and Eddie prepared for what he assumed would be the usual ritual. But James had something different to say. "Eddie, I'm releasing you from the promise. Not now, but when I'm gone. People need to know about the list. Not the specific names or moments, you keep those private. But they need to know that I carried it. That success doesn't erase invisibility, it just changes its shape. Maybe some young person out there is keeping their own list, feeling invisible despite being seen, and knowing that James Brown did the same thing might help them hold on." Eddie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They both knew this was goodbye, though neither said the word. James Brown died on Christmas Day 2006. Heart failure, the report said, though Eddie thought the truth was more complicated. You can only carry a list like that for so long before it starts to weigh on your heart in ways that become medical, physical, fatal. Eddie attended the funeral at the Apollo Theater, watched as thousands came to pay respects to the Godfather of Soul. He listened to the tributes about James's music, his innovation, his influence. All true, all important, but incomplete. For years after, Eddie wrestled with how to honor James's request. How do you explain something so personal, so painful, without exploiting it? How do you bear witness to invisibility without making it spectacle? Eddie started writing it down in 2008, filling notebook after notebook with his memories of those Tuesday mornings. But every time he thought about going public, something stopped him. The world wasn't ready, or he wasn't ready, or the timing felt wrong. Then came 2019, and Eddie's hands had gotten too unsteady to cut hair anymore. Arthritis had ended his career, and with it, the daily rhythm that had structured his life for over 60 years. He was sitting in his kitchen one morning, reading about another young artist who'd flamed out, died too soon from the pressure of fame and expectation, when he realized James had been right. People needed to know about the list, about the whispered ritual, about the way success and visibility can coexist with a profound sense of being unseen. Eddie's granddaughter found him at the kitchen table that morning, surrounded by the notebooks he'd kept hidden for so long. She was a journalism student, smart and curious, and when she asked what he was reading, Eddie made a decision. He told her about James Brown's Tuesday mornings, about the whispered list of invisible moments, about how one of the most visible men in American music history had needed a private ritual to remind himself he was real. The story his granddaughter helped him write didn't include names from the list or specific moments James had shared. They kept those private, as promised. But they told the broader truth about what the ritual meant. About how trauma from invisibility doesn't disappear when you become famous. It just puts on new clothes. About how James Brown, who taught America to feel the one, had needed to whisper his own existence into being every single week for nearly 2 decades. When the story was finally published in a small music history journal, it created ripples. Other people who'd known James came forward with their own observations, pieces of the puzzle Eddie hadn't known existed. A recording engineer mentioned how James would always arrive at sessions exactly 47 minutes early and sit in silence before they started. The time span matched Eddie's haircuts exactly. Band members talked about how James had certain superstitions, certain phrases he'd repeat before performances. And some of those phrases matched fragments Eddie had heard in the whispered ritual. Bobby Bird, in one of his final interviews before he died in 2007, had been asked about that cryptic comment he'd made years earlier regarding James having a conversation with himself that kept him alive. Now, with Eddie's story public, the interviewer's confusion made sense. Bobby had been talking about the ritual, obliquely honoring something he'd witnessed but never fully understood. James needed that conversation, Bobby said. We all need ways to remind ourselves we're real, especially when the world wants to turn us into symbols or products or anything other than human. James found his way. I'm just glad he had someone like Eddie to hold space for it. The most unexpected response to Eddie's story came from other barbers. Dozens of them reached out to say they'd witnessed similar rituals with other clients, Other famous people who needed a private space to process their invisibility. Actors who'd whisper their real names over and over, as if afraid fame would erase their original identity. Musicians who'd recite their failures, their rejections, their moments of doubt, needing to remember they hadn't always been successful. Athletes who describe childhood poverty in careful detail, making sure they never forgot where they came from. Eddie Wilson died in 2221 at the age of 94. His obituary mentioned his decades serving Harlem's artistic community, but the people who really knew, understood his most important work, had been those Tuesday mornings with James Brown, holding space for a legend to be vulnerable, bearing witness to invisibility, keeping a promise for 38 years and then breaking it at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. The story of James Brown's whispered ritual reveals something profound about fame, trauma, and visibility. Success doesn't heal the wounds of being invisible. Recognition doesn't automatically reverse the psychological impact of being overlooked, dismissed, or erased. James Brown achieved everything our culture defines as making it. He became wealthy, famous, influential, undeniable. And still, every Tuesday morning, he needed to whisper his list of invisible moments to remind himself he was real. This matters because we live in a culture that treats visibility as the ultimate goal and solution. We're told that if we work hard enough, achieve enough, become successful enough, we'll finally be seen. But James Brown's ritual suggests something different. It suggests that being seen and feeling seen are not the same thing. That external validation, no matter how abundant, doesn't automatically reach the places inside us that were damaged by being invisible. The ritual also reveals the importance of witnesses. Eddie Wilson wasn't a therapist or a confidant or even a close friend. He was a barber who showed up every Tuesday morning, created a safe space, and listened without judgment. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the healing isn't in being fixed or advised or analyzed, but simply in being heard, in having someone bear witness to your pain and confirm, by their steady presence, that your pain is real and you are real and your experience matters. For those who've carried their own lists of invisible moments, James Brown's story offers something valuable. You're not alone in that carrying. Even people who seem supremely confident, successful, and visible have their own lists, their own rituals, their own ways of reminding themselves they exist beyond how others perceive them. And there's no shame in needing those rituals. There's only the courage it takes to keep showing up, keep whispering your truth, keep insisting on your own reality, even when the world suggests otherwise. The barbershop on 125th Street is gone now, replaced by a modern storefront that sells expensive coffee and artisanal pastries. But if you know where to look, there's a small plaque on the building noting that Eddie Wilson cut hair there for over 60 years. It doesn't mention James Brown or the Tuesday morning ritual. That story lives elsewhere now, passed between people who understand what it means to feel invisible despite being seen, who know the weight of carrying a list, who recognize the sacred nature of having someone bear witness to your whispered truths. James Brown taught the world how to feel the one. But every Tuesday morning, in a locked barbershop with the curtains drawn, he taught Eddie Wilson something equally important, that even legends need to remind themselves they're real. One whispered memory at a time.